Every story begins with a truth and ends with a heartbeat. I'm Tisha, and I have a story to tell. So kick off your shoes, settle in, and let's begin. I walked from the reading room to the kitchen where Sylvie was preparing dinner. I took 2 glasses and poured some red wine, placing a glass on the counter in front of Sylvie. She smiled, wiping her hands on her apron, and then wrapped her arms around me. "I love you so much," she whispered. I pulled away and sat on the chair. Sylvie had an unnatural obsession with me. She left me no room to breathe, always following me, always needing to be close to me. Through the years, I became irritable with her, pushing her away when she reached to hug me, turning my face when she wanted to kiss me. I just couldn't stand her obsession anymore. One evening, as we were sitting in the lounge, I said, "This isn't working for me anymore." Her face drained of color. "What do you mean?" "Sylvie, your obsession, your possessiveness, always around me. It's driving me crazy. I'm leaving for a bit. I need to think." Sylvie went hysterical. "You cannot leave me. I won't let you. You promised me forever." Sylvie cried for hours, and maybe it was guilt, but I told her I will stay. I will try harder. She lay her head on my lap, and slowly, the tears stopped. Sylvie went to the kitchen and brought 2 more glasses of wine. She put mine on the center table and sipped hers slowly. The next morning, we sat around the kitchen table. Sylvie had poured 2 cups of tea. "Thank you," I said, and sipped it slowly. It tasted too sweet. Maybe she had put in too much honey, I thought. Then Sylvie asked me to get an old poetry collection in the attic. She said she wanted to read them, that it reminded her of when we first met. She was acting strange, very nostalgic and sentimental. I walked down the passage and climbed the stairs to the attic. I felt a bit dizzy, nothing hectic, but I was stumbling a bit. I lost my footing and tumbled down the ladder. I hit my ribs and scraped my hands. Nothing serious, but she'd insisted on taking care of me. I woke in the reading room with a jolt, as if my body had remembered something my mind had not yet caught up with. My eyes snapped open to the soft, slanting light that always filtered through the stained glass window around this hour, a mosaic of blood reds and bruised violets painted across the old wood floor. Everything looked exactly as I remembered it. The shelves towered around me, still bowing with the weight of 1,000 dog-eared lives. My tools, awls, thread spools, bone folders lay arranged with obsessive care on the side table. The old clock above the hearth ticked in its usual measured rhythm, never quite aligned with the hour. For a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. I saw a cup of tea sat beside me, in the blue ceramic cup Sylvie had made me in one of her pottery phases. I remembered setting it down after a sip. The surface was still, yet a thin skin had formed, that pale, filmy layer it forms when it stands too long. I reached out. The handle was ice cold. Strange. I didn't remember falling asleep. I stood slowly, wincing at a dull ache in my joints. I didn't have pain exactly, just like my limbs weren't entirely mine. I looked down and noticed I was still in the same sweater I'd worn yesterday, forest green, threadbare at the elbows, one ink stain on the cuff. My favorite. A creature of habit, Sylvie used to tease. But I didn't remember putting it on today. That should have been my first warning. The second came when I spoke. "Sylvie?" I called, though I wasn't sure why. My voice didn't echo or carry. It didn't even happen. My lips moved, my throat tightened, but no sound came. I pressed my fingers to my neck. My skin wasn't cold. It was cool, like water left out overnight. I didn't panic, but I felt an eerie, dreamlike curiosity, as if I were watching someone else's story from a distance. I crossed the room toward the front door, half expecting it to swing open, half hoping Sylvie would be there, smiling sheepishly with her ridiculous floppy hat and her sack of wildflowers. I reached for the knob, turned it, and pulled. Nothing happened. It didn't even rattle. I frowned and tried again. Still nothing. The lock wasn't engaged. The mechanism wasn't jammed. It just wouldn't move. I threw my weight into it, slammed my shoulder once, twice. The frame didn't creak, neither did the hinges strain. It was like the door was only pretending to be a door. I turned, eyes scanning the parlor. The windows, the side door, and the back porch were all sealed. I returned to the reading room, hoping to make sense from this. A journal entry, a misplaced day planner, anything to root myself in time. I saw a newspaper lying folded on the side table, beside my inkwell, and reached for it. The paper felt real. I read the headline. Local bookbinder found dead in study, fall, play not suspected. The headline struck like a hammer to the chest. Beneath it, a photograph. My face. It was slightly blurred. That half-smile Sylvie had caught in an accidental snapshot last fall when I wasn't paying attention and the leaves had just begun to turn. I sank to my knees. It all fit now. The cold tea, the silence in my throat, the stillness that was too still. I was dead. And yet, I was still here. A soundless scream built in my chest. I clutched the paper, crumpling my own obituary. I staggered back, knocking over the side table. The mug shattered, and this time, I didn't flinch. I wasn't sure I could. The fragments scattered across the rug. The clock ticked above me. I crawled to the mirror, the tall one beside the fireplace, antique silver frame with ivy filigree. I'd always hated it. It was too ornate for my liking. Sylvie had insisted it, anchored the space. I stood in front of it, but saw nothing. There was no reflection, just the empty room behind me, except I was there. I was still here, whatever here meant now. I don't remember how long I stayed curled in the corner after the mirror failed me. Time had already begun to unravel. The house was quiet, no creaking boards, no humming refrigerator, no birdsong outside. Even the light didn't change. I waited for night, for dawn, for something. The sound I heard was unmistakable, the metallic slide of a key in the lock. I bolted upright before I could stop myself, the instinctual rush of hope raking through me. The front door opened and Sylvie stepped inside. She was dressed in black. A black coat, black boots, a silk scarf at her throat that fluttered as she moved. Not morning clothes exactly. She paused in the doorway. The air moved around her, then she stepped over the threshold like she'd never left. I stood in the entryway, no more than 5 feet from her. I tried to speak, again, a whisper, a scream, anything. Nothing left my mouth but cold air. I tried to touch her shoulder. My hand passed through the wool of her coat like mist through fabric. No resistance, no warmth, but she stopped walking. She felt it. Her head turned slightly, and her lips parted. She knew I was there. Sylvie walked forward, heels tapping against the wood, her fingers brushing the tops of familiar furniture. A soft smile played at the corner of her mouth. She wasn't weeping. Her eyes weren't red. If anything, she looked rested, like she'd finally had a good night's sleep after weeks of storm. I followed her as she moved through the house into the kitchen, the hall, the reading room. She walked like a woman returning to a well-loved place, not one haunted by death. Then she said softly, "I kept my promise." I froze. Her back was still to me, but her shoulders lifted with the breath that followed. She walked to my chair, the leather one near the window, and sat without hesitation, legs crossed, arms resting on the sides like a queen taking her throne. Her gaze scanned the room. "You'll never leave me now," she said. I stared at her, at the place her hand rested on the armrest, at the relaxed curve of her lips, and suddenly, I wasn't afraid. I was furious. I tried to throw something, the book on the desk, the glass paperweight near the lamp. My hand passed through everything. I willed the bookshelf to fall. I tried to howl. The only result was a cold gust, a faint breeze that rustled her hair. She smiled. "I knew you'd try to fight it," she murmured. "But you'll see, this is better. We're safe now. No one can take you from me." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small, a folded paper stained with age. She unfolded it and read the words aloud. I recognized my handwriting. The days are quieter when you're gone, but they echo with your name. Come home soon. Always. E. A note. A trivial thing I'd tucked in her bag one afternoon years ago, before she left for Prague. I'd barely remembered writing it, but she had kept it. She folded it again and pressed it to her lips, then she stood. I'll see you tonight, she said softly, and she walked upstairs. The police had arrived after my death. Sylvie had told them that I had fallen from the attic. She explained that I wasn't feeling well that morning and had taken something for a headache. She convinced them that I must have felt drowsy when I climbed into the attic, stumbled, and fell. An autopsy was done, and my death was ruled an accident. That evening, she lit the hearth and poured 2 glasses of wine. She set them side by side on the table. She put on her old record player, Chopin, soft and sorrowful, and sat in my chair again. She spoke aloud to me about the funeral, the guests, the priest who mispronounced my last name, the neighbor who cried too loudly even though we never liked her. She told me she'd cleaned my headstone herself, that it was a modest one, just as I would have wanted, that she'd pressed dried lilacs into the soil. She laughed and cried at the same time, and when she was done, she turned to where I stood and said, I hope you're proud of me. I did everything right. Then she blew out the candle and left me in darkness again. In life, the house had been a sanctuary. Now it was a cage. At first, I told myself it was just the grief that made everything feel different, that Sylvie's strange behavior, her chilling comfort, her obsessive rituals were all symptoms of sorrow curdled into routine. But the house had begun to change. It started subtly. My books, those I'd lovingly arranged and restored, cataloged, dusted weekly, began to deteriorate. Not with the slow gentleness of age, but with sudden, unnatural rot. Leather cracked and peeled, pages curled, blackened at the corners. One morning, though I'm not sure it was morning anymore, I found the first edition of Leaves of Grass blooming with mildew. The corners of the ceiling in the reading room darkened, then began to drip something sticky. The wallpaper peeled itself back in strips, and the light, that beautiful filtered light through the stained glass window, lost its color. The reds turned to rust, the violets into bruises. I began to test the edges of the house. I walked the upstairs halls, the servants' stair, the root cellar I never used. The doors still opened, but only to empty rooms. Some smelled of soil, others smelt stuffy. None of them felt like mine anymore. The attic was the worst. It was where I'd fallen, not long before I died. A stupid accident. The kind you laugh about, with a sore back and a bruised elbow, where I'd been retrieving an old poetry collection Sylvie had asked for. I'd tumbled down the ladder, hit my ribs, and scraped my hands. Sylvie made me tea and held me while I slept. Now, when I stood at the base of that ladder and looked up, I felt something watching me from above. Not someone, something, and I realized with horror, Sylvie had killed me. I didn't climb up. Sylvie returned nearly every day. She never brought guests. She floated through the rooms, humming to herself, arranging dried flowers in vases and lighting candles she let melt into the floorboards. She cleaned around my space, polished the desk I used to work at, ran her fingers over the backs of my books like she was trying to memorize their shape. She left notes to me on the counter. You're quiet today. That's okay. I know it's hard. I made you tea. It's still your favorite, with honey. I miss you most in the quiet. I'm doing this for us. And I believed her for a time. That was the cruelest part. One night, I tried to write her back. I dipped my finger into the thick dust on the kitchen counter and scrawled my name. Eddie. She walked in moments later, arms full of lilac branches. Her eyes fell on the writing. She smiled and then wiped it away with her sleeve. You're still with me, she said. I screamed at her then, threw my voice into the void, willed the light to flicker, the walls to crack. I shoved every ounce of what I was into that scream. A single candle snuffed itself out, that was all. She laughed, giddy. "Oh, Eddie," she breathed, her voice trembling with joy. "You're learning."
I'd like to take a moment and pause. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Please show a kindness by clicking like and subscribe. It would help our channel so much. Let's continue our story.
It was around then I noticed something else. Grimalkane, the neighborhood stray who had always loved curling on my porch, stopped visiting. He used to yowl at the window in the mornings, demanding the saucer of milk I sometimes forgot to bring. I'd always joked that he was the real master of the house. But now he wouldn't come within 10 feet of the threshold. I saw him one afternoon, crouched on the sidewalk across the street, fur bristling, eyes wide. He stared at the front door like it growled at him, and then he ran. The birds followed, then the moths, then the ants. The garden stopped blooming. Sylvie didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she pretended not to. She clipped dead roses and arranged them like they were still alive. She dug in the soil without gloves, humming lullabies with no tune. She was keeping house for the dead, and it felt to me like the house liked it. But the worst was every night. She slept in our bed wearing my sweater. My scent, long faded, was something she tried to recreate. She sprayed my cologne on the pillows, wore my scarf, folded my bathrobe, and whispered goodnight to it. I stood by the window and watched her. Sometimes she whispered, "I love you. Stay." And part of me wanted to. Even now, because I remembered what it felt like to love her before the dark, before the obsession, before she turned the word always into a shackle. But another part of me, the part that was slowly learning to hate, whispered back, "Let me go." I didn't know they were burying me until I saw the procession. It was raining, of course it was, the kind of slow, thin drizzle that fogged glass and stuck to skin. I stood at the bay window in the reading room, my hand pressed against the cold pane, watching black umbrellas bloom like bruised flowers across the front walk. A hearse pulled up to the curb. Its doors swung open and out came a casket, wooden and modest. I would have chosen something more worn, more personal, maybe oak, lined with book pages, but this one was polished. I wondered if my body was inside, or if I had simply vanished. I watched the people shuffle through the rain, heads bowed. Some were familiar, neighbors I rarely spoke to, the old grocer who always insisted on exact change, even a few acquaintances from the local history society. I hadn't been close to anyone in town, not since the shop closed, not since my world shrank to Sylvie, the books, and the house. Still, they came, but none of them looked up at the window. None of them saw me. Sylvie stood at the center of the mourners, dry beneath the largest umbrella. She wore a long black coat buttoned to the neck and a dark fascinator netted across her face. Her hair was pinned neatly. She didn't fidget. She stood like a monument, like a widow carved from stone. I searched her face, hoping for some hint of sincerity, some crack in the mask, but her eyes were dry. When the priest spoke, I strained to hear. The words were muffled by the glass and the storm. I caught pieces. Dedicated craftsman. Peaceful passing. Survived by his beloved partner. May he find rest in the arms of eternity. I wanted to laugh. Rest? I pressed both hands to the window now, forehead against the cool glass. I'm not at rest, I thought. I'm still here. I never left. I tried to scream it. I did scream it, or tried to. My jaw ached with the effort. There was no sound, not even a rattle of the pain. The world outside went on without me. As they lowered the casket into the ground, Sylvie stepped forward. She knelt gracefully and laid a single white lily on top. Then she pressed her hand flat to the lid. Her lips moved, but I couldn't hear the words, but I knew them, because I'd said them once, years ago, when we were drunk on each other and the summer was too hot to sleep. Always, no matter where. It had been a promise that had become a curse. That night, she returned to the house alone. She didn't cry. She set her umbrella on the rack, unbuttoned her coat with care, and hung it neatly on the hook. She took off her heels and placed them side by side. Then she turned to the empty room and said, "I'm home." I hovered in the corner, invisible, watching, waiting, and hoping. She walked to the hearth and lit the fire. Then she spoke again. "You looked beautiful today," she whispered, as if I were lounging in my chair, a book in hand. "Peaceful. Everyone said so." I didn't move. I couldn't. She uncorked a bottle of red wine and poured 2 glasses, set them side by side on the coffee table, and clinked hers against mine. "To eternity," she said. She took a long sip, her gaze unfocused. "I did everything right," she added softly. "Didn't I, Eddie? You should be proud." Then she looked directly at the spot where I stood and smiled. Later, as the fire dimmed and the wine bottle emptied, she curled on the sofa, wrapped in my robe, humming some broken melody I half recognized from our first winter together. I stood by the window and watched the fog roll over the street. The last of the mourners had long since left. The hearse was gone. The world was still, and in that stillness, I heard her whisper, "You'll never leave me again." The words were not a vow, they were a lock. The first time I noticed the cellar door was open, I assumed it was a trick of memory. We rarely used the basement. The floor was uneven, the air always smelled damp, and the bulbs overhead flickered no matter how many times I replaced them. I'd always planned to renovate it, turn it into a proper archive for rare volumes, but the idea remained a fantasy, buried beneath everyday life. And now it was something else entirely. I found Sylvie there one night, or rather, I followed her there. She'd come home late. Her boots were caked in dark soil. She didn't notice me, she never did, unless she wanted to. I watched her unfasten her coat, move silently through the kitchen, then descend the narrow steps behind the pantry door. I hadn't known she had a key to that lock. I didn't know the lock even existed. My curiosity had become instinct. I moved through the shadows, sinking down into the belly of the house behind her. The steps moaned slightly beneath her, but didn't groan beneath me. The air grew colder with each level. At the bottom, the cellar had changed. Gone were the dusty wine racks and the forgotten bins of winter coats. The space had been cleared and scrubbed, then rearranged into something else. Lying on the bookshelf was a book, the book she had used to make her concoction to put into my tea. Next to the book were a few jars. One jar filled with roots, another had ash, and then some lily bulbs. She had kept the evidence here after she had poisoned me. The police never came down here to check. Then I saw, carved into the floor, was a name, mine, Eddie Marek, written again and again in concentric rings of ash and thread and something too dark to be dried blood. She stood barefoot in the center, her eyes closed, humming low and tuneless. I stumbled backward, trying to escape the circle. My non-body burned at the edges. I felt heavy again, as if being dragged toward her. The pull was warm, like coming home, but it wasn't home. It was a trap. She opened her eyes, looked directly at me, and smiled. "Still here," she murmured, pleased. "Good." After she left the cellar, I stayed. I couldn't help myself. I knelt before the name burned into the floor and tried to touch it. My fingers buzzed and I felt a pull, like a string that could snap if I dared enough. The next day, or what passed for day, I returned to the cellar alone. The markings were faint, my name barely visible. She had cleaned it up, like it was a dinner table after guests, as if nothing had happened. The house didn't just keep me here, she bound me to it. The fall from the attic hadn't killed me. The tea hadn't simply lulled me to sleep. My death wasn't an accident. It was orchestrated by Sylvie. I didn't sleep anymore. I drifted, if that's the word for it, from room to room, often forgetting how I'd gotten there. Sometimes I'd return to places I'd already passed through, only to find them slightly altered. A chair moved, a lamp lit, a door open when it hadn't been. Sylvie carried herself now with a kind of gentle madness, serene and terrifying. I watched her trace her fingers along the walls as if she were playing a piano only she could hear. I watched her talk to empty rooms. I watched her stir tea she never drank. Every so often, she would glance over her shoulder and smile as though I stood right behind her. Sometimes I did. She began leaving tokens for me. Little things. A dried flower beside the bed, a glove I'd lost years ago, folded neatly on the arm of my reading chair, my watch that stopped at the moment I died. It was a shrine, a theater of remembrance. Every room curated like a museum of us. And I wondered, was this her grief or her victory? That night, Sylvie stood before the mirror at the end of the hall, brushing her hair. She looked radiant. "Did you find it?" she asked softly. "I left it where I knew you'd look." I stared at her through the warped reflection. My face was clearer now, paler. My eyes had grown dark, sunken, and unfamiliar. I looked like something kept. Sylvie smiled at her reflection, as if admiring us both. "I told you," she whispered, "I would never let you go." They say ghosts haunt because they can't let go, but that wasn't true for me. I wanted to let go. I wanted release. I wanted silence, peace, rest. Anything that wasn't this dreamlike half-existence where I was trapped between memory and matter, locked in a house curated like a mausoleum with my name on every wall. But she wouldn't let me. Sylvie. My Sylvie. Now, I was her doll in rage. I discovered burns even in death. It began in the upstairs hallway, 3 days after I found the book. Sylvie had been gone most of the day, but I knew she would return before nightfall. She always did, like she was tending a secret garden, like I was something she needed to water, feed, and keep warm. I paced the halls. My steps left no sound. My body cast no shadow but my presence. My will was growing louder. She had told me once, "I feel you most in the walls." I wanted her to feel me now. I stopped before the mirror at the far end of the hall, the same one where my reflection had begun to return, slowly, piece by piece. Tonight, my face was almost whole, except for my eyes. They were empty, gone. I raised my hand and drove it toward the glass. For a moment, I expected it to pass through like before, but it didn't. The mirror shattered soundlessly, in slow motion. The shards hung in the air, suspended in gravity's absence, then cascaded to the floor in a soft clatter. I stood still and felt something change inside me. I had touched the world. That night, I raged. I swept down the stairs like a cold wind and flung open cabinets. Bottles smashed, silverware scattered. I ripped paintings from the walls. I overturned the chair she always curled in to read. I hovered behind her when she came home, close enough to feel the warmth of her skin, close enough to scream into her ear. I didn't have a voice, but the flame in the hearth leapt 3 feet high and she gasped. Then she turned, eyes wide, lips parted, and she smiled. "Oh, Eddie," she whispered, "you're finally learning." She wasn't afraid, surprised, or disturbed. She was delighted. She walked into the room and looked at the mess, the broken glass, the toppled books, the overturned tea tray. She ran her fingers along the edge of the shattered mirror and whispered, "You always hated this one." She wasn't haunted. I had played directly into her hands. "I knew you'd be angry," she said that night as she sat in my chair, holding one of my journals in her lap. "It's part of the process. Anger always comes after grief." She poured herself a glass of wine, then she poured another and set it beside her for me. "I don't mind the mess," she continued. "It means you're here, really here, not just fading." She flipped through the journal, read a passage aloud. I don't know what love becomes when it's no longer shared. A mirror with no reflection, maybe. A room with no doors. She looked up with tears in her eyes, but her smile never broke. I loved that one, she whispered. You always had such a way with sadness. I wanted to hate her, but there was something worse than hate stirring inside me. Recognition. Because I had loved her with the same intensity she now wielded like a weapon. I had whispered always into her mouth. I had promised eternity in poetic flourishes, inked my name across her memory, made her believe she couldn't exist without me, and now she believed it. The house responded to my rage like a beast stirring from sleep. The walls creaked in places they never had. The light dimmed even when the lamps were lit. The wood underfoot grew soft. I was no longer the ghost of this place. I was becoming its heartbeat, and it terrified me. I tried to stop, to withdraw. But Sylvie escalated. She began speaking to me constantly, touching objects I once held, whispering lullabies in languages I didn't understand, kissing mirrors. She brought strangers into the house. Only one. A man, tall, awkward but polite. He carried books and he smiled too much. At first, I thought she was moving on. A friend, perhaps, a distraction. But then I saw her pour him tea from the same kettle she had used on the night of my death. I felt the cold grip me again, and the man? He shivered as he drank. He looked around the room like he was being watched. His eyes landed on the hearth, then the cellar door, then the mirror upstairs. He left before dawn and refused to come back. A week later, I saw his obituary. A car crash. He lost control and swerved off the road. Sylvie read the article in silence, then she folded the paper, placed it in my desk drawer beside a dried rose, and whispered, "You protect me, even now." I didn't know the workroom could still hide secrets. It had always been mine, a world between worlds where glue and paper turned decay into permanence. I kept it pristine and off-limits. Sylvie knew that, or so I thought. The workbench sat quiet when I entered, untouched. The dust had gathered again, fine and gray, coating the tools I hadn't used since before. My awl was rusted through. The bristles of the binding brush had curled in on themselves. One drawer was cracked open, just barely. It hadn't been yesterday. I drifted to it slowly, watching the shadows shift around me. Inside, I found a scrap of red twine, knotted in a pattern I didn't recognize. Then, behind it, a false panel. One I had crafted years ago to hide small valuables, emergency cash, the spare key to my father's safe, a letter opener from Prague. I'd sealed it so well I had forgotten it myself, but Sylvie hadn't. Behind the panel sat a journal. It was wrapped in linen, bound by hand, my hand. The stitching unmistakable. She'd used the kit I gave her the first winter we lived together. The spine was crude. She'd bound it with love. The inside cover read, "For the time when you are gone, so I can remember the truth." The first entry was dated a year before my death. He doesn't see the distance yet, but I do. His love is still here, but his soul is drifting. He doesn't realize how loud silence can be. I turned the pages carefully because I wasn't ready to see what they held. I remembered that summer. Sylvie had taken long walks alone, always returning with scratched palms and red-stained boots. She said she'd been searching for mushrooms, that she wanted to learn the names of poisonous ones, just in case. I had laughed then. The room began to tilt, subtly. My reflection in the dusty cabinet glass flickered. My face wasn't mine anymore. I flipped to the last page, the final entry. I held him as the breath left. It was gentle, kind. He didn't even flinch. I kissed his lips as they cooled, whispered my name so he'd find me again. It worked. He's here. I feel him. He's cold, but close. I miss his voice, but this is better than a grave. This is love. I'm not a monster. I'm just not willing to lose him. I dropped the journal. The pages fluttered and landed face down on the floor. I wanted to scream again, but not from rage this time, from grief and betrayal. I had loved her completely. I had loved her without needing to be seen, and she had loved me like a child loves a snow globe, by keeping it sealed. That night, I returned to the reading room, sat in my chair for the first time since my death. Sylvie entered minutes later. She paused when she saw the dent in the cushion, and something in her flickered. She crossed to me, knelt beside the chair, and laid her head where my hand would have been. "You're upset," she whispered. "I understand. You needed time." I didn't move. I didn't answer. "I did it for us," she murmured. "This was the only way to keep you from slipping away." Then she looked up, right at me. Her eyes were tired but full. "Tell me you understand. Just nod. Just something." I stayed still. Then I vanished. I vanished back into the cracks of the walls, into the floorboards, into the places she couldn't see but always felt. I had no words left for her, only silence. Sylvie rarely spoke aloud now. She moved in whispers, touching objects I once held, speaking to corners I once stood in. She wrote letters to me, sealed them, placed them under my pillow. I read them, though she never saw me do it. They were always the same. "I miss you. Please come back. Say something. Anything. This isn't enough, is it? I'm sorry, but I had to." I never replied. She would find the letters crumpled, torn, or untouched, and each time she cried less and smiled more. Her mind was unraveling, but it unraveled toward me. Like every thread pulled from her thoughts wound itself into a noose, and she was wrapping it lovingly around both our necks. One night, she dragged the music box from the attic, the old one, the one we'd found at the estate sale in Dresden, carved with roses and serpents. It had never worked right, always played the waltz too slowly, too low. She set it on the mantel and wound it carefully, then pressed play. The song began, low and halting, like footsteps down a long corridor. The tune, sweet once, now sounded funereal. Sylvie danced alone in her nightgown, hair loose, trailing across her back like shadow. She danced with both arms out, as if I were there. I stood at the edge of the room, watching her twirl. Her eyes were closed. Her lips moved. "I know you're here," she whispered. "You still love me. I can feel it." She spun, slower now. Then she stopped and opened her eyes. She was looking right at me. I didn't move. I simply watched, and I think, in that moment, she knew something had changed. The warmth was gone from me. The anchor she had sunk into my soul had begun to strain. The day I remembered dying. Memory, when you're dead, is not a river. It doesn't flow. It pools in strange places, eddies in corners, grows stagnant, or turns viscous. The moments you want most are always out of reach, while the trivial ones, like the way the light fell on a page, or the shape of a crack in a teacup, resurface again and again. But sometimes, the weight of truth is too heavy even for the veil of death to hold, and it breaks through. It began with the teacup, not the broken one I had shattered in the parlor during my first days as a ghost. This one was whole. It was set carefully on the side table beside my old reading chair. I remember, it was a blue porcelain teacup with a gold trim, chamomile steam curling faintly inside. I stared at it for a long time. Sylvie wasn't in the room. There was no wind, no open window, but the steam swirled around through the air, and as I moved toward it, the memory struck like a lightning bolt. I had been sore. That's what I remembered first. Soreness in my ribs, the dull ache from the attic fall the week before. Sylvie had fussed over me more than usual, hovering and clucking her tongue, offering me tea every few hours like I was a fevered child. I'd been touched by it, even a little amused. "Chamomile," she'd said that evening, pouring it herself from the kettle I kept in the workshop. "Your favorite, with honey, just how you like it." She sat beside me on the settee, closer than usual, her eyes bright but red at the edges, like she'd been crying. I remember watching the steam rise between us. I remember lifting the cup to my lips. It had tasted too sweet, but I didn't protest. I remember the feel of her fingers brushing my forehead, the way she hummed that half song, the one without words, as I began to sway, how she lay beside me on the couch, gently shifting my head to her shoulder, her breath in my ear, her heartbeat slowing to match mine. And then I remembered nothing. There was no pain, no sound, absolutely nothing. The last thing I heard, just before the world went black, was her whisper, "You'll never leave me again." The truth was unbearable. I hadn't slipped away in sleep or died of an accident or illness. Sylvie had killed me. She hadn't poisoned me in the way one thinks of poison. She had used something subtle, old, traced back to the same book that now lived in the cellar. A sleeping draft from root, ash, and crushed lily bulb. It was safe in small doses, but lethal in the right hands. Hers. And as I faded, as my shape began to disintegrate into wind and ash and silence, I touched the music box. The lid snapped shut. The waltz stopped. I turned away from her for the last time and whispered, "Let me go." The house stands. It always does. Even now, it still looks whole from the outside. Just another forgotten Victorian on a road no one drives anymore. Windows clouded the garden dead, fence crumbling. They say a woman lives there still, alone. They say she never speaks to anyone, that she leaves her curtains drawn and her doors locked even in the brightest daylight, and sometimes, late at night, music can be heard. Too slow, too soft, like a song from underwater. The same note over and over. But sometimes, in the quietest moments, if you press your ear to the wood and hold your breath, you can still hear the whisper, "Let me go." Thank you for spending time with me. If this story moved you, share it. Someone else might need to hear it too. God bless you.